The late summer sun dipped low over the rolling hills outside Boise, pouring heat onto the small town that lay at the edge of the valley. The air shimmered, heavy and restless, as if even the trees longed for evening to come. On Main Street, the heart of the town, the little grocery store with its faded sign and creaky wooden steps drew people in the way it always did near the end of the day. It wasn't just a place to buy bread or milk. It was where the town gathered, where stories were traded and judgments were passed as freely as the candy at the counter. That evening, 3 women stood outside the store, their shopping bags resting on the bench, voices carrying in the thick, still air. Martha Jenkins, her hair pinned up tightly in a bun that seemed older than her years, shook her head as if she couldn't quite believe what she had heard. Beside her, Betty Collins leaned forward, eager, her eyes bright the way they always were when a new piece of gossip came her way. Gloria Simmons, quieter but no less judgmental, pursed her lips, waiting for the moment to add her own comment. "I told you," Martha said, fanning herself with a folded receipt. "That girl Evelyn just up and left. Left the baby right there with Mark. Barely 4 months old, and she just walked out." Betty's eyes widened with delight, though she tried to hide it behind a look of concern. What kind of mother does that? A baby that small needs his mama every minute of the day. Gloria crossed her arms, letting out a long sigh. "I never trusted her, not once. She always seemed different, like she didn't quite belong here. Kept to herself too much. Never really made friends. And now look, a woman who can't even stand by her own child." They spoke louder than they needed to, perhaps because in a town this small, words carried just as quickly as whispers. A few other shoppers lingered near the door, pretending to check their bags while really straining to hear every word. Martha sniffed, settling deeper into the judgment that felt comfortable to her. "It's the way of the world now. Back in my day, no mother would have dreamed of leaving her baby, not for anything. You married a man, you stayed, you raised the children, and that was that." Betty leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, you know Mark isn't exactly a saint either. People say he used to fight all the time with his ex. And Evelyn, she's just a slip of a girl. Maybe she couldn't handle him." "Even if that's true," Gloria replied, her lips thin, "you don't abandon a child. That boy didn't ask to be born. Now he's stuck with a father who can't keep himself steady, let alone care for a baby." The conversation rolled on, sharp as gravel underfoot, each word painting Evelyn as reckless, weak, or selfish. To these women, it didn't matter what lay beneath the surface, what struggles might have driven her decision. What mattered was the story, and the story was that a young mother had left her baby behind. Inside the store, at the counter near the register, Nurse Claire Dawson placed a carton of milk on the belt and listened quietly. She had lived next door to Evelyn and Mark for years, seen more than most about what happened behind their thin walls. She had noticed the bruises Evelyn hid beneath long sleeves in the middle of July, the hollow look in her eyes after sleepless nights, the way she lingered outside with the stroller, as if fresh air could wash away despair. Claire knew what the others didn't. Evelyn hadn't abandoned her child at all. She had asked Claire to look in on the baby when Mark was at work, had left careful notes on feeding times, on formula measurements, on which blanket soothed him when nothing else would. Evelyn hadn't left to escape her responsibility. She had left to apply to Boise State, determined to carve out a future and, in her own quiet way, to force Mark to understand the weight she carried every day. But Claire said nothing. She let the women talk, their words clattering like loose coins. In a town like this, sometimes silence was safer than truth. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, gave the cashier a small smile, and left the store without offering a single correction. Outside, the gossip continued, as if carried on the warm breeze. Martha's voice rose above the others. "Mark will never manage. Men like him don't change. You'll see, that baby will end up worse off than any of us can imagine." Betty clucked her tongue. Shameful, Simply shameful. Gloria nodded, satisfied with the chorus of agreement. Well, I suppose some people just aren't meant for family life. The sun slid lower, shadows lengthening across the street. The town would go on talking about Evelyn Carter long into the night, reshaping the truth to fit their own judgments. But behind those whispered condemnations lay a story no one truly knew, a story waiting to unfold in ways that would surprise them all. Evelyn Carter's story had never been one of ease or comfort. Her earliest memory was not of a gentle lullaby or a warm embrace, but of flashing police lights cutting through the night. She had been just 3 years old when her father, in a drunken rage, took her mother's life. The act shattered what little stability existed in their home and left Evelyn alone in the world. Her father was sentenced for second-degree murder and sent to prison. From that night on, Evelyn became a ward of the state, shuffled into the foster care system with nothing but a threadbare blanket and the echo of chaos. She grew up drifting from one house to another. Some families were kind but distant, others resentful of the extra mouth to feed. She learned quickly how to make herself invisible, quiet, polite, helpful with chores, anything to avoid being moved again. Yet no matter how many families she passed through, there was always the looming truth. She had no one who was truly hers. No grandparents to call, no aunt or uncle to visit during holidays. The word family felt foreign, something other children had, but she did not. Despite the loneliness, Evelyn carried within her a gentleness that surprised even her social workers. She loved children, perhaps because she had never really been allowed to be one herself. In high school, she volunteered in after-school programs, gravitating toward toddlers who reached for her hand without hesitation. Their trust, simple and unconditional, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't found anywhere else. After graduation, she enrolled in a short certificate program for childcare, determined to build a life around something that mattered to her. By 19, she was working as an assistant at a daycare center in town. The pay was barely enough for rent in a shared apartment and secondhand clothes, but she never complained. Watching a child smile because she had soothed their tears meant more to her than a paycheck. It was during those commutes to work, early mornings when the valley was still wrapped in mist, that Evelyn first noticed the bus driver. Mark Carter was older, nearly 30, with broad shoulders and a quiet, almost brooding presence. He had a reputation in town. Hardworking but rough around the edges, a man who had already been through one failed marriage. Evelyn knew little of the details, only whispers about fights and a woman who eventually walked away. At first, Mark was just another face in her daily routine. But he noticed her. She was the quiet passenger who always sat near the middle, clutching her worn bag on her lap, eyes downcast but alert. There was a softness to her that drew him in, a fragility he mistook for need. He began by waving off her fare, insisting she didn't need to pay every time. Then he started small conversations, asking about her work, the weather, the long hours. Evelyn, shy and unused to attention, answered politely. She didn't realize at first how much those brief exchanges began to fill the hollow spaces in her life. Mark was attentive in a way she hadn't experienced before. He would stop by the daycare sometimes, bringing her coffee or offer her a ride home when the evening shift left her waiting at the bus stop. He wasn't charming in the polished sense, but his gestures carried weight for someone who had so rarely been noticed. For Evelyn, who had grown up believing she was disposable, his steady presence felt like a gift. When he asked her to dinner, she accepted. When he bought her a bouquet of wildflowers from the roadside stand, she blushed as if it were roses. And when he eventually asked her to marry him, without much ceremony, without a ring more than modest, she said yes. It wasn't passion that drove her answer. She didn't believe in fairy tale love. Her life had taught her better. What she craved was security, a place to belong, someone who would say, "You're mine," and mean it. Mark, with his steady job and his quiet insistence, seemed to offer exactly that. The wedding was simple, almost rushed. A courthouse ceremony, a handful of signatures, and they were husband and wife. No family to witness it on her side. Only a co-worker who hugged her afterward and whispered a quick blessing. Evelyn told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was that she finally had a last name that wasn't temporary, a home where she could close the door at night and know it wouldn't be taken away. Yet beneath the fragile joy lingered an unspoken truth. Evelyn had married not out of love, but out of a deep hunger for stability. She believed affection might grow with time, that kindness could evolve into love if she worked hard enough. She was willing to give herself to the hope of it, even if the spark was never truly there. For Evelyn Carter, it felt like the beginning of safety. What she didn't yet know was that safety in Mark's world came with conditions, rules written in silence, demands she had not yet been asked to meet. At first, Evelyn believed the quiet of married life would bring her peace. She moved into Mark's small house on the edge of town, a modest place with a porch that looked out over the fields. For the first time in her life, she had a room that was hers, a kitchen where she could cook, a bed she could sleep in without wondering who might move her tomorrow. But almost immediately, she learned that this security came at a price. Mark had his ways, and those ways were not to be questioned. He noticed everything: the way she folded laundry, the way she scrubbed the counters, the way she set the table. If a shirt wasn't folded along sharp lines, he showed her how to do it again, standing over her until she matched his example. If the potatoes in her stew were cut in wedges instead of neat cubes, he pushed the bowl away and muttered that it wasn't the way he liked it. When she swept the floor, he pointed out the corners she had missed. At first, Evelyn thought it was only adjustment. After all, she had never had a home of her own before. Perhaps she was clumsy. Perhaps the standards were simply higher than hers. She apologized, tried again, bent herself around his instructions. It was easier to yield than to argue. But with each correction, she felt the walls of the house closing in a little more, as though the roof and the walls themselves carried his will. Despite his demands, she clung to her job at the daycare. The children's laughter was her only breath of freedom, the place where she remembered who she was outside of his shadow. She would leave in the mornings with a small smile, clutching her tote bag, determined not to let Mark see how much she needed that escape. At the daycare, she sat cross-legged with toddlers who pressed sticky hands against her cheek or bent down to help a shy little girl tie her shoelaces. It was messy, noisy, exhausting work, but it filled her with a joy that housekeeping never could. Mark, however, didn't see it that way. "I don't understand why you bother," he said one evening, watching her iron her uniform blouse. "I make enough for both of us. What's the point of slaving away for a few dollars when you could be home keeping things in order?" Evelyn's hand stilled on the iron, but she didn't meet his eyes. "It's not about the money," she said softly. "I like being there. I like working with the kids." He snorted. "Wiping noses and changing diapers? That's what you call work? You'd be better off raising our kids right here when the time comes. Then at least all your effort would mean something." She folded the blouse carefully, pretending not to hear the sting in his words. Inwardly, she reminded herself that she had heard worse. She told herself that love, if not love, then partnership, was about compromise. If she was patient, if she kept the peace, maybe in time he would soften. But Evelyn carried a secret he did not know. At night, after he had fallen asleep in front of the television, she would sit quietly at the kitchen table with her old laptop, the screen's glow lighting her determined face. She researched programs at Boise State University, scrolling through requirements for early childhood education. She read about classes, student teaching, and the possibility of one day becoming not just an assistant, but a licensed teacher. The idea felt daring, almost dangerous. She could picture herself standing at the front of a classroom, her voice calm and sure, the children looking up at her with trust. It was a vision of a life she hadn't dared imagine before. She didn't tell Mark. She knew what his response would be: derision, perhaps anger. He would never approve of tuition costs or of her leaving the house for more hours each week. To him, a wife's place was at home. keeping dinner warm and shirts pressed. So she kept it hidden, tucked away like a fragile seed. Her dream might take years, might require courage she didn't yet possess, but it lived within her all the same. And though Mark's voice was the one that echoed loudest in the house, Evelyn carried another voice, quieter but steady, the one that whispered she was meant for more than this. When Evelyn told Mark she was pregnant, his reaction was almost boyish, a flicker of genuine joy that caught her off guard. He lifted her off her feet in the kitchen, spinning her once before setting her down, the rare sound of laughter breaking through his usual gruff tone. For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to believe this child might change everything, that it might soften his edges, that it might bring them closer together. But joy quickly hardened into control. From the day she showed him the ultrasound, Mark began issuing rules. No more heavy lifting. Don't take the bus. Don't eat that. Doctor says it's not good. Every action was met with correction. Every decision questioned. He reminded her daily that her most important job was to protect the baby. When she insisted on continuing to work at the daycare, he frowned. Why stress yourself with other people's kids when you should be resting? You've got one of your own to think about now. Evelyn smiled tightly, unwilling to argue. She needed her job, not just for the income, but for her sanity. The hours spent among children's laughter kept her from drowning in the silence of their house. At the daycare, she still felt like herself. But at home, under Mark's watchful eyes, she was nothing more than an incubator, a vessel for the child he wanted. As her belly grew, so did his expectations. He expected hot meals ready on the table, laundry folded precisely, and the house spotless despite her exhaustion. If she forgot to vacuum or sat down too long in the afternoon, he made a pointed comment. You've got plenty of time to rest when the baby comes. Right now, you should keep the house in order. It's not that hard. Evelyn said nothing, biting her lip to keep from crying. She didn't tell him about the backaches that left her doubled over, or the nights when she lay awake, her mind racing with worry. When the baby finally came, it was after a long, grueling labor that left her drained. Their son was born small, his cries thin and feeble. The doctors assured her he was healthy enough, but warned he would need extra care. Evelyn cradled him in trembling arms, her heart aching with love and fear in equal measure. She whispered his name softly, over and over, as though saying it might anchor him to the world. Mark's pride shone in the hospital room, but it quickly gave way to criticism once they returned home. The baby cried endlessly, through the day, through the night, refusing to settle no matter what Evelyn tried. He spit up formula, arched his tiny back, screamed until his face turned red. Evelyn walked the floors for hours, her body aching, her eyelids burning from lack of sleep. You must be doing something wrong, Mark snapped when he came home from work to find her pacing with the baby. All day you're here and he still cries like that? You worked in childcare, didn't you? Shouldn't you know how to handle your own son? Evelyn's lips quivered. I've tried everything. He just won't stop. Mark's glare hardened. This is because you kept working while you were pregnant. I told you it was too much stress. You didn't listen and now look. A weak baby, all because you wouldn't quit that stupid job. The words cut deeper than any wound. Evelyn turned her face away so he wouldn't see the tears sliding down her cheeks. Nights blurred into days. The baby's cries became a constant backdrop to her life, a sound she could no longer escape. She stopped brushing her hair, stopped looking in mirrors. Meals were forgotten, laundry piled high. She had no energy left for anything but rocking the baby, whispering prayers into the dark, begging him to sleep. Mark grew more distant, coming home with a scowl when dinner wasn't ready, when the house smelled of sour milk and dirty diapers. His disappointment hung in the air, heavy as the baby in her arms. Other women managed just fine, he muttered. What's wrong with you? Evelyn began to believe him. Her chest ached with guilt every time her son wailed. She told herself she was failing him failing as a wife, failing as a mother. She felt herself slipping into a fog she couldn't climb out of, a place where even hope felt unreachable. The doctors called it postpartum depression. Evelyn didn't have words for it. She only knew she was drowning. And in the middle of that drowning, she realized one truth. No one, least of all Mark, would pull her from the water. The weeks after the baby's birth should have been tender, filled with lullabies and soft light. For Evelyn, they blurred into something far darker. Her son's constant cries gnawed at her nerves until even silence felt unbearable, as though it only hid the next storm. She wandered the house in sweatpants and wrinkled shirts, hair uncombed, skin pale. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Mark's voice cut through that exhaustion like a blade. He came home to a sink full of bottles, toys scattered across the floor, a wife slumped in a chair with a crying baby pressed against her chest. His disappointment never softened, it sharpened. "Look at you," he said one evening, tossing his jacket onto the couch. "You can't even keep yourself together. Do you know what the guys at work say about their wives? How put together they are. Fresh makeup, dinner on the table, kids bathed and smiling. And I come home to this mess." Evelyn tried to explain, her voice thin, that the baby hadn't slept for more than 20 minutes at a time, that she hadn't eaten since morning. But her words only fueled his disdain. "Excuses," he snapped. "Do you know how hard other women work? Take Lisa down the street. 2 kids, both well-behaved, and she still looks like she could be in a magazine. Or Sarah, always smiling, how spotless. Why can't you be more like them?" The comparison struck harder than his words alone. Each name, each example of another woman's supposed perfection, chipped away at Evelyn's fragile sense of self. She stopped answering. She learned to lower her gaze, to nod silently until his anger ran out. But sometimes anger turned physical. The first time it was an open-handed shove when she moved to, slowly clearing the table. The second, a sharp slap when she dared to argue that the baby's cries weren't her fault. She told herself it wasn't serious, that it would never happen again. Yet the bruises bloomed across her arms and cheekbones, small shadows she tried to cover with long sleeves and careful makeup. When the neighbors asked about her hollow eyes or the mark on her jaw, she smiled tightly and said she'd slipped on the porch steps. When Nurse Claire, ever observant, caught sight of a fading bruise under her collar, Evelyn forced a laugh. "I'm clumsy. You know me." Claire didn't press, but the quiet sorrow in her eyes told Evelyn she wasn't fooled. Shame became Evelyn's constant companion. She moved through each day with the baby in her arms, rocking him against her shoulder while whispering apologies he couldn't understand. She apologized for his tears, for her failures, for existing in a world that seemed determined to crush her. And yet, even in her collapse, she kept going. She measured formula with shaking hands, wiped spit up from his chin, rocked him until her own body swayed long after she'd set him down. Her love for him, fragile, desperate, was the only thing that anchored her. Without him, she might have let herself disappear entirely. Still, a thought began to take root, small and dangerous. Each time Mark's voice rose in contempt, each time she traced makeup over another bruise, it whispered louder. He will never understand. Not until he lives it himself. The idea frightened her at first. It felt like treason against the vows she had made, against the fragile hope she once carried. But as the days stretched into endless nights, as Mark's scorn grew harsher, the thought became less a betrayal and more a possibility. Perhaps he needed to know what it meant to be alone with a wailing infant, to feel the bone-deep exhaustion, to face the endless cycle of feeding, rocking, cleaning, and starting again. Perhaps only then would he grasp the weight she bore every hour of every day. The thought didn't bloom into a plan, not yet. But it sparked in the darkness, a tiny flame of defiance Evelyn hadn't felt in years. She tucked it away, hidden like all her other secrets, but its light lingered, waiting for the moment when her breaking point would turn into something more. The idea had lived in Evelyn's mind for weeks. flickering faintly at first, then growing stronger each time Mark's voice cut into her like a knife. He would never understand, not until he was left alone with the child, forced to carry the endless burden she bore every day. The thought no longer frightened her, it steadied her. And so, one warm morning, as the baby fussed in her arms and the sun spilled harshly across the kitchen floor, Evelyn finally decided. She called on the only person she trusted, Nurse Claire Dawson, the neighbor who had always watched with quiet eyes, never judging, never prying. Claire had seen Evelyn at her lowest, had noticed the bruises she tried to cover, had offered a gentle smile when others turned away. When Evelyn stood in Claire's doorway, baby balanced on her hip, the words tumbled out in a whisper. "I need your help, just for a little while. I'm going to Boise, for the university." Claire blinked, but said nothing at first. Then she stepped aside, letting Evelyn into her small, tidy living room. "Tell me," she said softly. And Evelyn told her about Boise State's early childhood education program, about the form she had filled out late at night while Mark slept, about the placement test scheduled for that week. Most of all, she told her about the plan. She would leave the baby with Mark, just for a few days, while she went to Boise to file her application and take her exams. Claire would stop by when Mark was at work to check on the baby, to make sure he was safe. But otherwise, everything would be in Mark's hands. "He has to know what it's like," Evelyn said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with conviction. "He has to see what I live every day. If he doesn't, nothing will ever change." Claire studied her carefully, then nodded. "You're right, but you know what people will say." Evelyn gave a bitter smile. "They already talk. Let them." 2 mornings later, she rose before dawn. She dressed quietly, pulled her hair into a simple braid, and kissed her son's forehead as he whimpered in his crib. Her bag was packed with the barest essentials, a change of clothes, her documents, and the address of the admissions office. She left instructions on the kitchen table, detailed notes on feeding times, formula measurements, and bedtime routines. She imagined Mark rolling his eyes, scoffing at her neat handwriting. Still, she left them. When Mark came home that evening, he found the note and the baby, but not his wife. The town noticed her absence almost immediately. In a place where even a new haircut sparked speculation, the disappearance of a young mother was fuel for a fire. Outside the grocery store, voices rose in judgment. "She left? Just like that?" Martha gasped, clutching her shopping bag to her chest. "With the baby still nursing age?" Betty added, though she knew little of infant care herself. "What kind of woman does that?" Gloria shook her head gravely. "A selfish one. Always knew she didn't have it in her. Now that poor child is stuck with Mark." The story grew with each telling. Some said Evelyn had run away to start a new life. Others whispered she'd found someone else in Boise. The more outrageous the rumor, the more it spread. To the town, her absence was betrayal enough. Through it all, Claire remained silent. She listened as the women wagged their tongues, their voices thick with scorn. She said nothing of the truth, that Evelyn was in Boise, chasing a dream too fragile to expose to gossip. That Evelyn had not abandoned her child at all, but had trusted that sometimes the hardest lessons required absence. When Claire stopped by the Carter house in the evenings, she saw Mark's struggle firsthand. He tried to hold the baby, rocking him with stiff arms, muttering curses under his breath when the crying didn't stop. The bottles piled in the sink, laundry scattered across the couch. Mark's eyes grew heavy, his hair unkempt, his patience thin. And still the baby cried. Claire wanted to help, to reach for the child and give Mark a moment's peace. But Evelyn had been clear, don't do it for him. Just make sure the baby is safe. So Claire stood back, offering only a word of reassurance before leaving. Each night, as the town buzzed with stories of Evelyn's supposed betrayal, Claire carried the truth quietly in her heart. She knew Evelyn had not walked away out of weakness. She had walked away out of strength, out of the desperate need to be heard in a marriage where her voice meant nothing. And somewhere on the highway between Boise and that small Idaho town, Evelyn pressed her forehead against the bus window and whispered to herself, "This is the only way." The first night without Evelyn seemed manageable enough. Mark told himself he could handle it. After all, how hard could it be? He had worked 12-hour shifts behind the wheel of a bus, wrestled with drunks, driven through winter storms. One crying baby couldn't be worse than that. But by midnight, his confidence had already cracked. The baby's wails pierced the silence like sirens, sharp and relentless. Mark tried everything, bouncing him against his chest, pacing the narrow hallway, humming tunelessly under his breath. Nothing worked. The boy's tiny fists beat against his father's shirt as if to protest the very world he'd been born into. By dawn, Mark's eyes burned from lack of sleep. The kitchen was a battlefield. Half-washed bottles cluttered the sink, powdered formula dusted the counter like spilled flour, and a damp burp cloth lay crumpled on the table. The baby finally dozed in his arms, but the peace lasted only minutes before the cries started again. Mark muttered curses, though not at the child so much as at his own helplessness. He fumbled with the formula, spilling half the scoop on the floor. The baby screamed louder while he shook the bottle, the sound drilling into his skull until his hands trembled. When he finally managed to feed him, the baby spat most of it back up, leaving milk stains down the front of Mark's shirt. By the second day, the house no longer looked like a home. Dirty onesies piled on the couch. Damp diapers filled the trash, and the faint sour smell of formula clung to every surface. Mark staggered through the mess, shirt untucked, hair unwashed, clutching his son with the same desperation Evelyn had carried for weeks. He thought of the times he had complained about coming home to a sink of dishes, about dinners reheated instead of fresh. Now he stared at the chaos and realized he couldn't even summon the strength to boil water. Exhaustion hollowed him. Each time he tried to lay the baby in the crib, the cries rose again, thin but merciless. So he carried him everywhere, while heating bottles, while trying to shovel down a sandwich, while collapsing onto the recliner only to jolt awake seconds later. His arms ached, his back throbbed, but he dared not let go. In the evenings, when the sun slid behind the hills and the house fell into shadow, loneliness pressed down harder than fatigue. He looked at the clock, willing the hours to move faster, imagining Evelyn walking through the door with her calm hands and patient whispers. Instead, silence stretched around him, broken only by the baby's restless cries. On the third night, after hours of failed rocking and useless lullabies, Mark sank onto the living room floor with his son in his lap. His eyes stung with tears he hadn't expected, hot and unfamiliar. He had never cried in front of anyone, not since he was a boy, but the helplessness stripped him bare. "I don't know what you want," he whispered to the infant, his voice cracking. "I don't know how she does it. God, I don't know how she does it." The baby quieted for a moment, staring up at him with wide, watery eyes before beginning to fuss again. Mark pressed his forehead against the tiny chest, rocking gently, and realized for the first time how heavy solitude could be. Evelyn had carried this every day, with no relief, no one to take over when her arms gave out. By the fourth day, his nerves were raw. He caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, hollow eyes, stubble grown rough across his jaw, a milk stain dried across his shirt. He looked like a stranger, not the man who had once lectured Evelyn about keeping herself presentable. His voice echoed back in his mind. Other women manage just fine. Why can't you? The irony seared him. He couldn't manage at all. When the baby finally fell asleep that afternoon, Mark sat in the rack of the living room, staring at the bottles scattered across the coffee table, the diapers stacked in the corner, the laundry spilling out of the basket. He felt a heaviness in his chest, deeper than fatigue. It was something closer to shame. For the first time, he admitted the truth. He couldn't do this alone. He needed Evelyn. The thought humbled him in a way nothing else had. She wasn't weak, she wasn't lazy. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. and he, left alone with the child, was breaking. That night, with his son finally asleep on his chest, Mark whispered into the dark, "Come back, Evie. Please." The house gave no reply, only the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing. But the words lingered, raw and real, carrying more honesty than anything he had spoken in years. By the 5th day, Mark was unraveling. The sleepless nights had stripped him of pride, and the endless cries of his son had worn his nerves thin as paper. He no longer bothered with the dishes, no longer tried to keep the house in order. His only focus was keeping the baby alive, feeding, rocking, pacing, begging. That evening, after the child had finally dozed off in his arms, Mark sat in the darkened living room, staring at the glow of the phone on the coffee table. He had resisted calling Evelyn for days, clinging to his pride, convinced he could prove her wrong. But now, pride felt useless, a weight he could no longer carry. With trembling fingers, he dialed her number. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. Her voice, quiet and cautious, answered on the other end. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and the words tangled there. When they finally came out, they were nothing like the harsh commands he used to throw at her. "Evelyn, it's me," he whispered. "Please, I can't do this anymore." There was silence, just the faint sound of her breathing. "I thought I could handle it," he went on, his voice breaking. "I thought you were exaggerating, that you just didn't try hard enough. God, I was wrong. I was so wrong. He cries all the time. He won't eat, he won't sleep. I can't even put him down for a minute. I don't know how you've done this day after day. I don't know how you've kept going." He pressed a hand over his eyes, swallowing hard against a sob that threatened to rise. "I said terrible things to you. I compared you to other women, called you names, blamed you for everything. But I see it now. You were holding this family together, and I was tearing it apart." Still, Evelyn said nothing. "Please," he whispered, desperation raw in his voice. "Come home. I miss you. He misses you. We need you. I need you. I swear I'll change. I'll help, I'll listen. Just don't leave me like this." On the other end of the line, Evelyn's hand tightened around the phone. She sat in a small rented room in Boise, the application papers for Boise State stacked neatly on the desk. Her heart ached hearing his voice, so broken, so unlike the man who had once belittled her daily. Yet she remembered every bruise, every sharp word, every night spent crying in silence. She didn't trust his promises, not yet. She had heard apologies before, followed by the same patterns. But this voice was different, stripped of arrogance, hollowed by exhaustion and fear. For the first time, Mark was speaking not as the man who demanded obedience, but as a man afraid of losing the woman who held his life together. His pride had dissolved, leaving only vulnerability. Evelyn closed her eyes. She could almost see him in their cluttered living room, the baby asleep against his chest, the mess of bottles and laundry surrounding him. For once, he was tasting the chaos she endured daily. But she didn't answer his plea. She let the silence linger, heavy and deliberate. Finally, she said softly, "I'll be back, but not yet." Mark inhaled sharply. "Please don't. Not yet," she repeated, her voice firm though her heart trembled. "You need to understand, Mark. Really understand. I'll come home when I know you do." The line went quiet, but she didn't hang up right away. She listened as his breath shuddered on the other end, as though he was holding back tears. Then, softly, she ended the call. Mark lowered the phone to his lap, staring at the dark screen. The silence of the house pressed in around him. For the first time in his life, he felt not just tired, not just frustrated, but afraid. Afraid of what life would look like without her. As the baby stirred in his sleep, Mark bent over and whispered, "I'll make it right, Evie. I swear I'll make it right." But the words felt fragile in the stillness, as though they could dissolve at any moment. By the end of the week, Evelyn boarded the early bus back from Boise. She sat by the window, watching the dawn break over the valley, her papers from Boise State tucked safely in her bag. The exhaustion of travel pressed against her, but beneath it was a calm resolve. She had kept her word. She had given Mark the time to live her life, if only for a few days. Now it was time to see what he had learned. When she stepped onto the porch of their small house, the sight that met her was worse than she had imagined. The curtains were half drawn, the trash bin overflowing with diapers, the faint sour smell of formula seeping through the screen door. Inside, the living room was a storm of clutter, bottles scattered across the coffee table, burp cloths draped over the couch, laundry spilling across the floor in chaotic piles. Mark was slumped in the recliner, their baby sleeping against his chest. His hair stuck out in uneven tufts, his face shadowed with stubble. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. He blinked at her as if he wasn't sure she was real. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice raw with relief. He shifted carefully, laying the baby in the crib before standing to face her. The sight of her standing in the doorway seemed to undo him. "You're here." "God, I thought," his voice broke, and he raked a hand down his tired face. She set her bag down quietly. "I told you I'd come back." He crossed the room in a few quick steps, words spilling out faster than he could contain them. "I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. I didn't know. It's worse than I ever imagined." He cries and nothing works. "I tried everything, Evie, everything. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten right. I thought you were exaggerating before, but you weren't. You were carrying all of this on your own." His voice cracked again, and he sank onto the couch, looking up at her with something she had never seen in him before. Humility. "I was wrong. About you, about everything. I should have helped. I should have seen how much you were doing. I was blind and I hurt you. Please forgive me." For a long moment, Evelyn only stood there, the weight of his words hanging between them. She remembered every slap, every insult, every comparison to other women. She remembered the nights she had rocked their son until her arms gave out, while Mark sat oblivious in another room. His apology didn't erase those wounds. Yet she could also see the man before her now, not arrogant, not sneering, but broken and humbled. The chaos of the house testified more than his words ever could. He had tasted the reality she lived every day, and it had nearly undone him. "I believe you," she said finally, her voice steady. "I believe you know now how hard it is. But things can't go back to the way they were. I won't let them." Mark looked up quickly. "I'll change. I swear I will. Whatever it takes." "I'm going to keep working at the daycare," Evelyn continued, her chin lifting slightly. "And I'm going to Boise State. I've already filed my application. I won't give that up. Not for you, not for anyone. If we're going to make this marriage work, you need to understand that my life matters too. My dreams matter." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The fight seemed to drain from him, leaving only weary acceptance. "You're right," he said softly. "You deserve that. More than anyone. I'll figure it out. I'll do better." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. She didn't trust promises easily anymore, but she could see the change, not complete, not permanent, but real. He had been forced to walk in her shoes, and the lesson had left its mark. She moved past him, picking up their son from the crib. The baby stirred but settled quickly in her arms, his tiny body curling against her with familiarity. Evelyn kissed his soft hair, closing her eyes as relief washed over her. Behind her, Mark stood silently, watching her with a mixture of awe and regret. He didn't try to touch her, didn't press for more than she was willing to give. For once, he seemed to understand that her presence was not owed to him. It was a choice she had made, and one she could unmake if he failed again. Evelyn opened her eyes, meeting his gaze across the cluttered room. "If you want this family to survive, Mark, it won't be on your terms anymore. It'll be on ours. Equal. Do you understand?" His voice was low, but there was no hesitation. "I understand." And for the first time, Evelyn almost believed him. The weeks that followed Evelyn's return were not easy, but they were different. Mark, once quick to criticize, now held his tongue. He stumbled often, burning dinner, folding laundry into awkward lumps, forgetting to add detergent to the washer, but he tried. And that effort, more than perfection, shifted the rhythm of the household. In the mornings, he rose earlier to take the baby so Evelyn could rest an extra hour. In the evenings, he carried groceries, changed diapers, even took turns pacing the floor when their son refused to settle. The tasks that once seemed invisible to him now carried weight. He no longer assumed they happened on their own. He knew who had carried them all along. It wasn't transformation overnight. Old habits lingered, impatience surfaced, but humility tempered him. When Evelyn reminded him to load the bottles into the dishwasher, he nodded instead of snapping. When he saw her pack her books for an evening class in Boise, he asked how long she'd be gone, not whether she should go. Evelyn moved carefully, guarded but firm. She set boundaries he had never known before. She would continue at the daycare. She would attend classes at Boise State. She would not surrender her life to his convenience. And to his surprise, Mark found himself agreeing, not because he wanted to, but because he now understood the cost of ignoring her voice. Their home, once a place of tension, slowly grew into something closer to balance. The clutter still gathered, diapers, bottles, toys, but it no longer represented chaos alone. It was the mess of two people learning, imperfectly, to share the weight. One quiet night, the baby finally fell asleep without a fight. The small house seemed to exhale with relief. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, textbooks spread open before her, a highlighter resting between her fingers. The soft lamp light caught the lines of determination on her face. For the first time in years, she wasn't surviving day to day. She was building a future. From the kitchen sink, the sound of running water mingled with the clink of dishes. Mark stood there in rolled-up sleeves, rinsing bottles and stacking plates. It wasn't grand or heroic, but it was steady. Each plate washed was a quiet acknowledgement of what he had once refused to see. Evelyn looked up from her notes, watching him for a moment. She didn't smile, not fully, but there was a trace of softness in her eyes. The sight of him standing in that kitchen, shoulders bent to a task he once scorned, was proof enough that some things could change, even if slowly. She turned back to her book, pen scratching against paper. Her son stirred in the crib, then sighed into deeper sleep. For once, the house held peace. The revenge Evelyn had imagined hadn't come with anger or retribution. It had come with silence, with walking away just long enough for Mark to taste her world, to feel the exhaustion, the isolation, the unending responsibility. He had lived her reality, and in doing so, his arrogance had cracked. That was her victory. Motherhood, Evelyn knew now, was the hardest work of all. It was endless and unseen, heavy and relentless. It was a labor that demanded not just love, but sacrifice. No woman should have to carry it alone. And sometimes the only way to make someone see that truth was to let them live it themselves. As the night deepened, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The pages of her textbook rustled in the soft breeze, drifting through the open window. She thought of the road ahead, classes, exams, nights like this filled with study and fatigue. But she also thought of the freedom she had claimed, the dream she had refused to surrender. In the kitchen, Mark set the last dish on the rack and dried his hands on a towel. He glanced toward her, watching her bend over her notes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt not superiority, but respect. The house was still modest, still cluttered, still filled with the cries of an infant, but it was no longer a place where Evelyn's voice was silenced. It was a place where she had reclaimed it, piece by piece, and in that quiet victory, she found her sweetest revenge.